I've been coming to this festival and closing it in the marquee. I can't do it tonight because I'm performing at the Edinburgh Festival. And for the last 2 or 3 years, as the gentleman at the back will know, I've kind of said that the reason I call this show, when it's at the Edinburgh Festival, Rock and Roll Politics, is not because there's any rock and roll during the hour. In this chapel, there's going to be none at all. But it's a metaphor for politics being all shook up around the world, but in the United Kingdom is where we're going to focus for our half an hour together. Now, here is my confession. If I'm truthful with you, for the last few years when I've claimed that politics is all shook up, it was actually fairly stable, at least retrospectively. But this year, I can truthfully stand in this church and not lie and say politics really is all shook up. And what happened was this: I was at the Edinburgh Festival last year saying, and indeed here, saying, oh, it's all shook up, and when it wasn't really. Cameron had just won an election in the United Kingdom. Nicola was ruling Scotland like she was ruling that marquee. And but then in about September time, I got a call from David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, for those of you who've forgotten him. And he said to me, Steve, Dave here, I hear you're doing this show in Edinburgh and here at Traquair, where you pretend politics is all shook up. What are you going on about? I've just won a general election against expectations. I expect to be here for 5 years. Everything's very stable. You're going to have to scrap the show, aren't you? And I said, well, David, yeah, I probably will have to scrap the show. It's all too stable. He said, well, look, let me try and help. How would it work if I call a referendum on the European Union? Would that help your show? I said, well, David, thank you very much indeed. But would it also help if, against all expectations, I lose? Thank you, David. That really would help this metaphor of rock and roll politics work. Then I got a call, if I get regular calls, from the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. And he said, Steve, it's Jeremy here. I hear you're doing a show where you claim politics is all shook up. Well, it's not. It's not. How would it help if I discovered the only Virgin train in the United Kingdom with spare seats and pretend it was absolutely packed? Would that help? I'll do it while you're in Edinburgh, Steve. So Jeremy was very, very helpful. Nicola, who we've just seen, is always very helpful about the metaphor. Even when things were stable, she was helpful. Losing a referendum on Scottish independence and then conquering Scotland, that kind of helped. Anyway, I got a call from her and Theresa May in very, very close succession. Theresa May phoned me up just after the referendum, before she was Prime Minister, and said, Steve, I know you're going back to Scotland to claim politics is all shook up. Just to let you know, the Conservative Party will help you out this time. We're going to hold a leadership contest, which will last for about 1 hour. And at the end of it, I shall emerge triumphant. And then what I will do is I will go straight up to Scotland to see Nicola's not here, is she now? You've got to check sometimes, these people might be in the audience. I'm going to go up to Scotland to see Nicola, and I'm going to trap her very early on in my leadership. I'm going to say to Nicola that the Union, the United Kingdom Union, not the Holy Union in this chapel, the United Kingdom Union is my overwhelming priority, preserving that union. And I want to do everything I can, Nicola, to help Scotland and represent Scotland in my Brexit negotiations. Steve, that will trap Nicola Sturgeon. Well, I got a call very quickly after that from Nicola Sturgeon. She'll confirm it. She's just outside. Nicola, did you phone me up? Anyway, and Nicola said to me, I hear Theresa May is coming up to trap me by claiming that the union is her priority and she's going to protect Scotland's interests. I won't be trapped. I'm going to still dangle in front of her the prospect of that referendum on independence that will come to torment her. And so begins the dance to the death of Theresa May and our friend Nicola Sturgeon. But they aren't the only ones who helped out. Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet helped out with this metaphor of politics all being shook up. The Sunday after the referendum, I got one call after another from members of the shadow cabinet, all announcing they were resigning. and say, would this help your metaphor of politics being all shook up? If I got one call from somebody saying, would it help if I joined Jeremy's shadow cabinet and then resigned 2 days later? And on it went until we are here, I think, in total agreement that politics is all shook up. Now, we're only here for a very short time. The show I actually do lasts 48 hours. We're going to have a half-hour version. So what I'm going to do is 3 things in the half hour. I'm going to talk about a couple of things I talk about in the longer show, which I think kind of starts to make sense of why we are where we are. I'm going to talk about the referendum as a dark, dark device, and the political honeymoon. We're going to have a look at the political honeymoon as an equally dangerous, dark, dark device. And then I want you to become a politician, if that's all right. Now, I was going to ask you to become Nicola Sturgeon, but as she's outside, it might be a bit risky and psychologically complex. So what I'm going to ask you to do, while I'm talking for 10 minutes, I want you to become, if that's all right with you, Theresa May, the new Prime Minister. Don't look so miserable, it'll only be for about 5 minutes. And I'm going to present you with the dilemma she faces, even though she's on a honeymoon. Because one of the interesting things, I think, about politics is not the easy satire, which is fashionable, especially at the Edinburgh Festival, oh, they're all a bunch of bastards, isn't that hilarious? It's to actually look and delve a bit more deeply into the psyches of these people and the problems they face. So I'm going to ask you to become Theresa May. But before I do, how have we got to where we are in the United Kingdom? Now, I think there are some people in here from the United States. We can't beat you when it comes to politics being all shook up. And when it comes, it's really, at the Edinburgh Festival, I say, is there anyone here from America? And if no one puts their hand up, I say, thank God, frankly, because we can't top what's going on in the United States. But we can, to some extent, compete, because nothing makes sense anymore. As I say, we have the SNP losing that referendum and then conquering Scotland. We have UKIP with wacky leaders but still strong. We have the Labour Party staging 2 leadership contests in the space of a year, and we have the Conservative Party holding a contest that lasted for 1 hour, and then Theresa May surfacing from nowhere, this curious sort of unelected Prime Minister. How have we got there? Now, the 2 things I wanted to look at briefly. One, the referendum. See, I think referendums in the United Kingdom are dark, dark devices. They draw a Prime Minister towards them in a way that is like a magnet. And when the Prime Minister looks at a referendum, he or she melts, becomes so excited by the prospect of the liberating impact of a referendum. But when they have to come to call a referendum, it clobbers them. They lose all control. I remember, you'll all be too young to remember him, but there was a Prime Minister called Tony Blair a few years ago. You might remember he fought a war and that kind of thing. Anyway, before all of that, in 1997, just before he won his first general election, Blair was committed to holding all kinds of referendums on everything from electoral reform. He was going to send, you might remember him, Roy Jenkins around the country on electoral reform. Poor old Jenkins rode over, excited about electoral reform. And he was going to hold one on the euro, referendums everywhere. And I remember saying to Blair, just before he won in 1997, when you win, Tony, we're going to be in the polling stations continuously with these referendums. We're going to be voting all our lives. And he just looked at me without hesitation and he said, you don't think I'm going to hold any of these things, do you? I mean, they're really, I'm not that daft. And he wasn't, you see, because he could see these referendums are dark devices which give the impression to a Prime Minister, a nervy Prime Minister, that they're in control when they're actually losing control all the time. And when Cameron announced the referendum, his second referendum, you from Scotland know all about the first one, so do we, the rest of us, he was really excited. He announced he was going to hold a referendum, and he felt free. Prime Ministers, presidents, losing candidates in presidential elections, the stage narrows as they move towards power. And Cameron had become trapped. he had this UKIP party breathing down his neck. Nigel Farage, remember him? He was their leader. He's resigned twice. He'll be their leader again by the autumn. And Farage was tormenting Cameron before the last general election. We're going to get Conservative MPs defecting left, right and centre. Oh, they're coming all over the place. And Cameron believed him, because behind that Etonian, Bullingdon Club thing was deep insecurity. He offered the referendum and he was free. Farage could say nothing. Yeah, well, we've always wanted a referendum. We're quite pleased he's holding one. Thank you and good night. He had silenced this tormenting figure, Farage. He could go into that last silly British general election of 2015 to pretend he trusted the voters. He didn't. No Prime Minister wants to call these things. So he could say at the election, I'm delighted. We're trusting the voters on Europe. We're giving them a referendum. The Labour Party, under that North London intellectual mendacious fool, won't give you one because he doesn't trust the people. Edmund, I trust the people. Oh, it was working for Cameron like gold dust in a chapel. And then he had to hold it. He named the date. And that's when it all started to go wrong, because they are dangerous, these things. He thought this liberating instrument would be his salvation, and it destroyed him. And the reason it destroyed him is because, in a way that's quite Shakespearean, British politics are conducted on the whole in Scotland and at Westminster behind closed doors, and we have a theatrical facade up front. It's certainly true with the SNP. Nicola rules that party with a Blair-like control. They all keep to the same message in public and so on. It's all hidden. But a referendum opens the door. Cameron had no choice but to let his cabinet ministers row in public. Now, what happens then is something bizarre. We all know that this cabinet disagree with each other, hate each other, but we need them to pretend otherwise. And once the spell is broken, things are never the same again. And the other thing the referendum does, it throws up Shakespearean conflicts of loyalty. So, for example, to take the case of the Justice Secretary, Michael Gove. At the beginning of the year, he was in agonies. I'm surprised he wasn't in this chapel praying for salvation. Who was he loyal to? His two best friends in British politics, Cameron and Osborne? Or was he loyal to his conviction, which is that he wanted Britain out of the European Union? And in a Shakespearean way, he agonised in public. And behind closed doors, if you want a Shakespearean analogy, think of Macbeth. He sat with his wife, the journalist Sarah Vine, with all there's 30 columns in this, if I keep him going. And he said, what am I going to do? Am I loyal to my beliefs? But if I prevail, I destroy Cameron and Osborne, my two friends. Cameron was totally confident, because the referendum is such an illusion to leaders, that Gove would back it. He was saying to journalists who came to see Cameron, no, Gove and I go back a long way. I invited to Chequers on Boxing Day. He'll be with me. He'll be with me. He wasn't. In that Shakespearean conflict, he opted to betray his friend Cameron and campaign for out. And then we had that other Falstaffian figure of Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, announcing in February, Boris had said to Cameron he would be backing him at one point. And a friend of Boris's said to me, the problem with the theory that Boris might argue for out is that he believes we should be in, which, when you think about it, is quite a big problem. One that Boris leapt over with effortless grace. And there he was one dark Sunday afternoon outside his house in Islington, his cycling shorts on, Mayor of London, announcing to the assembled media, I'm for out. I think I'm for out. Am I for in? No, I'm for out. I'm definitely for out. I've decided, we might have a second referendum. No, we won't have a second referendum. We're just out. Out. That's what we are. Out. Cameron, sitting there in number 10, couldn't believe this act of betrayal. His not friend, because they've always hated each other, but the figure he thought would be with him in that campaign went the other way. Now, there are many deeper currents which explain Trump, which explain UKIP, which explain the SNP dominating Scotland. But these referendums are dangerous. And when leaders hold them, Cameron, remember, called the one in Scotland, not Alexander, they all start to go wrong. And as Nicola now contemplates a second referendum in Scotland, she will discover too, it will be the first that she has in effect instigated. Nothing ever goes to plan with these in the United Kingdom. They torment leaders. We in the United Kingdom had one under a previous Prime Minister. Harold Wilson held one on Europe in 1975. We're always holding referendums on Europe. I don't know why. We shouldn't hold them at all. They destroy us as well as the leaders. And Harold Wilson, this figure from the dim, distant past, 1975, even though he won the referendum then, the referendum tormented him because it exposed all the divisions in his government at the time. And he watched the cabinet ministers rowing in public, people like Tony Benn, Jeremy Corbyn's great hero. With respect to my cabinet members who are arguing for in, if we transfer power to Brussels, we will destroy the Westminster Parliament. And my cabinet ministers arguing for in are lying to the British people about what it means. Harold Wilson sitting there in number 10, oh my God, how am I going to put all this together? Harold Wilson was regarded by many as paranoid. I can tell you he had a lot to be paranoid about. And that referendum too destroyed the Labour Party. Within 5 years, a separate party had formed. They are dangerous, and it's interesting. I'm hearing, some of you might be hearing too, that Nicola Sturgeon is seriously contemplating a referendum within the next 2 years. She needs to watch it. But the other person it tormented, because referendums infect everybody in politics, including the voters, was Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader. Jeremy Corbyn has never had a conflict of loyalties in his life until he became leader. He's been an MP at Westminster since 1983, and the only decision he ever had to make as he cycled from his house in Islington, very near Boris's house, is how many times that week he would vote against his party's leadership. That was the level of his conflict. But when he was leader, he couldn't follow, for the first time in his life, conflict arose. He couldn't follow his convictions, which would be to leave the European Union, because as leader of his party, which he never expected, his party wouldn't accept it. So Jeremy, in a Tony Blair-like way, discovered a third way, which was to argue for the European Union, but very reluctantly. And the most dark, hilarious meetings took place during the referendum campaign. You might have seen some of them, where there was a Labour Remain campaign in which the head of that campaign, the guy Alan Johnson, would say, "Ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, the United Kingdom Labour Party is the only party committed passionately to the European Union, and here to explain why is our leader, Jeremy Corbyn." And Corbyn would walk on, rapturous reception as he always gets at a meeting. And this is a summary of Corbyn's address. "Comrades, it's great to be here this morning. Could I first of all say that the European Union's approach to Greece is an absolute disgrace. We are with Greece. We are anti-austerity and against the corporatist, capitalist classes of Brussels. Second, you might have noticed the European Union is currently negotiating a trade agreement with the United States. It is a disgrace. It is a reflection of the corporatist focus of the European Union. It will stop us from renationalising the railways, and it will prevent us from expanding the NHS. It is a disgrace. We regard that as totally against what we believe. Finally, I'd like to say Labour's position is to back Remain. Thank you very much." And a bewildered Alan Johnson will walk on and say, "Well, I hope you now all fully understand why we are united behind the European Union." And it would, but he too became a victim, because then the shadow cabinet clobbered him. David Cameron became a victim, and then Theresa May emerged from the 1 hour leadership contest. Michael Gove betrayed Boris Johnson and stabbed him. Gove then announced his candidacy, the most bizarre leadership launch ever, in which Gove basically said this at his launch: "You might have read that in the past I've said I'd be a bad leader of the Conservative Party." Well, I still believe that. I would be terrible. I've got no charisma. When I was Education Secretary, I alienated all the teachers. When I was Justice Secretary, I alienated all the lawyers. I can't manage people. I've just betrayed my friend Boris Johnson. I'd be terrible. I'm standing for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And in a weird way, it made Jeremy Corbyn's speech about Europe seem like an evangelical crusade in comparison. He fell by the wayside. They all fell by the wayside until, we had Andrea Leadsom, who was a candidate for 2 minutes, and then she said she should be Prime Minister because she's had children. The bar set low for leadership these days, but that for being the only qualification. And so Theresa May, all of you, because you're about to become Theresa May, surfaced regally from nowhere to become Prime Minister. And then displayed part cleverness, coming to Scotland right away and danced to the death with Nicola. That was clever. But she's also done some dangerous things. Her cabinet reshuffle, Nicola Sturgeon could be ruthless, but her cabinet reshuffle was the most ruthless ever witnessed in recent times. And anyone to do with Cameron or Osborne were just removed from the political stage. Corpses piled up. She sacked Osborne, the Chancellor. She sacked people like Nicky Morgan at Education. They all went. To the extent that we journalists at Westminster that morning, every Conservative MP came up nervously when they clocked what her priorities were to say to us journalists, just to let you know, I've never met David Cameron or George Osborne in my life. I've never supported them, never back. I think there's a photo of me and Cameron at Village Fete. I was airbrushed in. I've done no... They were all trying to distance themselves in that fickle, brutal world of politics, knowing that if they get decisions wrong, it all goes wrong. Which brings me to you on your political honeymoon. Perhaps Nicola's still on hers, but you, Theresa May, are definitely on yours. And that means you've got to get decisions right while you're on a honeymoon because it's dangerous, it's beguiling. The media doesn't scrutinise you. People tell you how wonderful you are, whereas mostly in British politics you're told how awful you are. It's dangerous, but you've got a big, big decision to make. And if you want an example of what goes wrong in British politics, if you make a mistake, I'll tell you a little private story. After the Labour MP, the UK Labour MP, Ed Balls, lost his seat at the last election, 2015, I met up with him, had a coffee. He was obviously miserable. It's a very personal rejection. And we were talking about what he might do next, and he wasn't sure, but he said to me, this was last July of a year ago, he said, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I can 100% guarantee I will never do any of these TV celebrity shows. From September, Ed Balls will be in Strictly Come Dancing. That's how brutal failure can be in politics. So in the few minutes left, I want you to become Theresa May and explore the brutal world of politics. And I'm going to present you with a dilemma. You, Theresa May, have just come back from holiday. You've been up a Swiss mountain. You've had fondue and red wine, and you had pleasure. You have pleasure when you see the opinion polls. The Labour Party is nowhere. But you've got to make one big call now. Do you call an early UK general election? Now, here's the temptation for you, Theresa May. If you call it, you could win a landslide. You've got to get Brexit through a House of Commons with just a majority of 12 at the moment. 12 that Ken Clarke has described as some of the most insane people in the United Kingdom. With one leap, you could be free and have a majority of 200. The Labour Party will be nowhere. How can people like Hilary Benn from the Labour Party, the UK Labour Party, go on a BBC programme and say, given that in July he said that he had no faith in Jeremy Corbyn, he thought he was a disaster. How can he go on a programme when an interviewer would say to Hilary Benn, Mr Benn, how are you advocating Labour in this election when you think your leader is a disaster? Well, I've looked at Jeremy over the last 2 days and I've changed my mind. And that's all he'd be able to say. And so it's Theresa's to win. So tempting. But here are the downsides. If you go for an early election, the spell that you have cast as a one-nation Prime Minister above the fray, working with Nicola in Scotland, all the other levers you've pulled goes. The spell ends like that collective cabinet responsibility during the referendum. You will come out as nakedly self-serving. I don't mean literally naked in the chapel here, I mean metaphorically naked, self-serving. You've got a problem as well in that you supported the Fixed Term Parliament Act in the last Parliament, which means in theory you do not dissolve Parliament for 5 long years. If you want to dissolve Parliament, you would have to do something out of Monty Python's Flying Circus. You would have to announce you have no confidence in yourself or your government, and therefore Parliament needs to be dissolved. That's so out of character to you, Theresa May, above the fray. But if you were to do it, you would be walking on water. So there are your dilemmas. Theresa May's in the chapel today. We have a kind of divine contribution to make, so we'll get this one right. How many of you Theresa Mays here in Edinburgh, not Edinburgh, that's what I say at the Edinburgh Festival, here at Traquair House? I did Nicola Sturgeon yesterday at the Edinburgh Festival. That was really interesting. I thought it would be too dangerous to do with her outside. Theresa May, how many of you go for the early election? Interesting. I thought it might be many more, about a third. How many of you, well, I didn't have to ask you, maybe it's a bit of fun. How many of you, Theresa Mays, go for that long haul till 2020? Oh, right, so you're for the early election as Theresa May.
But not for success, for failure.
For failure? You mean you want to lose as Theresa May? Right, well, we won't enter that tortured psychological side. Would one of the Theresa Mays who called for an early election, who wants to win, explain why?
I want the Brexit thing brought up, big stuff.
Ah.
That's what I would have it done.
So you as Theresa May would want, what, your own mandate for Brexit, get it sorted out?
I would like the world and members of Parliament to overturn it.
Oh, overturn it. But if you win, but that's your personal view.
No, but you see, she could actually
cheating,
also,
really.
She also could have other things coming in her, and that could be part of the
Ah, so you think Theresa May wants it overturned?
Yes.
Oh, we're getting deep into her. She did back Remain.
Sort of, but I still think she thinks it's the
Yeah.
right way to go.
Okay, so you call an early election, right? You're on one of the big TV shows on one Sunday morning. An interviewer. But you, as a Conservative Party, won an election last summer. You forced us to have a referendum. Scotland had elections for its parliament in May. How dare you take us to the country again just so you can get a majority of 180? Don't do that, Theresa. That's not the way you should respond. Go for it. By the way, that interviewing question and technique would be much better than Andrew Marr or John Humphrys, but other than that, it's totally realistic.
Now, I really would love that to happen.
I don't think you can say that live. You've got to say.
Sorry, I wasn't.
But you've got to be Theresa May.
Yes.
So you've got to pretend it's to do with the nation.
Well, the nation really is wanting a bigger discussion on this now, and it's a way of extending it into it legitimately.
Oh, a bit of legitimacy talk,
Course,
that always
yes,
goes down well.
Yeah.
Give her a call, that should be good. And just very quickly, one of you going for that long haul, with a bunch of nutters, as Ken Clark said, majority of talk. Yeah, why'd you do that?
Because we have a 5-year act. We have already heard the referendum, we've heard the voice of the people. We're going to go back to the people. We're going to say, oh, we're not quite sure what you want. We know what they want. There's been a huge political fallout, which is not foreseeable at that time. We're not going to destabilise Britain further by having another general election. Who knows what the result will be? And we've got a mandate from the referendum to do something that's the most important thing that's happened in this country for the last 50 years.
Right, I think you should give her a call. That sounded very convincing as well. I think we'll send her an invoice. Yeah. She's broke. Well, we are. I mean, as far as the country's concerned. But you see, that's fascinating. Your good answers, both of them. It's just an example of a small dilemma that she faces. But if we are right in this chapel tonight, I might tweet the fact that you've made this prediction, although I have to make one qualification. When I was at the big marquee last summer, I asked the audience, this was the final event of this great festival, how many of them thought Britain would vote to leave the European Union? And I think, as you remember, one person put their hand up. So what I'm trying to say politely is that this is the least reliable gathering in the whole of Scotland and the United Kingdom to make a judgment, so much so that I now predict Theresa May will call an early election. Either way, I think we can agree that everything is truly shook up. We've got United States dramas to come in November as well. So I think we all need to get together next year and make sense of politics when it will be, I suspect, even more shook up. Thank you so much.